once again to discuss things.
Tired of talking to you guys. It's been like 4 fucking hours. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Geeky Gentlemen. We are beginning Geeky Gentlemen History Month, the month in which we discuss the contributions that Geeky Gentlemen have made to history, but that have been ignored by a biased educational system, except not at all. See, here's the thing about making that joke in that fashion, where I give a lot of lead up to it. Is it doesn't work with lead up. It only works if people legit think that's what we're talking about, and then I burst the bubble. But I don't care anymore. Now it's become a tradition. So this week, or this month, we are starting off with a discussion inspired by a conversation I was having with someone else, and I wanted to get these two jokers' thoughts on it. So we're starting off with the question of how accurate to the actual history does a thing, like a movie, book, whatever, have to be that says it is based on true events? So, because I think he'll probably have the most intriguing opinion, Steve, what do you think?
It doesn't have to be accurate at all.
Oh, wow. Okay. Rasco, how about you?
I guess because of what the word base, because it's a kind of vague word, I guess I would agree. It doesn't really have to be that accurate at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
And see, I feel like if you're doing that point, then it's a distinction where we're not using the word based here as a synonym for inspired. We're using the word based here on this film is portraying events that actually happened. I feel like that is the distinct, because that is the connotation you get from the word based on film. So with that context in mind, does anyone want to change their answer?
I'm sticking to it. I don't think it has to be accurate at all.
Okay, Rasco?
Oh man, I think that oh shit. I can't say, it's good. It's too complicated how I feel to just answer that.
Okay, that's fine.
Because there's an example in my head that breaks what I want to say.
No, that's fine. So we'll get to that. I'll just give we'll go right to you then. I just want to give my quick answer in which I say, yes, it should on some level. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it should at least strive for some level of accuracy, because if you're just going to write your own thing anyway, then there's no point. But what is your complicated feeling then, Rasco?
Okay, so I was going to say that I think you have to, I think that you have to stay true to what literally happened for the most part that we can know, but the specifics don't have to be accurate. And I think that a good example is, so I have not seen this, but have you guys ever heard of Band of Brothers?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So apparently, that's based on a true story. But, the main liberty is that they condensed the actions of a large amount of people to a few characters. There were a lot of things that happened to a bunch of different people. And instead of just telling all of those stories, they condensed it down into, this person is dealing with, 5 different people's, lives. We condensed those 5 people into one. That's what I've heard. Now, I'm really unfamiliar with that. But I think that's not a problem for me. But that is really changing the history when you're saying that we're just going to cancel out people and attribute them to other people. That's where I still think I don't have a problem with that, but I think that you're getting really far away from the truth of what literally happened, but you're at least to some do you understand what I'm saying?
No, I get
it's
you.
kind of hard.
Yeah.
I feel that the problem here is when you let something be based on a true story, but then you just take it so far out, you really create a problem. And again, I feel like at that point, just tell a fictional tale or put inspired by, because those are two different things. Mitch Hedberg has a great joke, which is, did you hear about that old lady who ran into a telephone pole downtown? And I was like, yeah, I did. And it inspired me to write this story about a gorilla that breaks out of the zoo. Like, you can be inspired by anything. And you can be inspired by true events and then make a fictionalized, highly fictionalized account of those events. And that I have no problem with. My problem is when you do something that is based on a true story, because people are idiots, you are coloring their perceptions of history in ways that I am just fundamentally uncomfortable with, whether or not I agree with the message you are sending with that fictionalized account. And so I'll talk about the thing that started this discussion, which is I was trying to do a video with Manos about the new movie that is out in theaters right now, Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, that is about the founder, or the creator of Wonder Woman, and Professor William Moulton Marston, and his polyamorous relationship with two different women, in which he lived under the same roof as them for a number of years until his death. And then after his death, those two women lived together for about 40 years until one of them died. All right? And so the movie portrays not only a romantic relationship between the women and Marston, but a romantic relationship that exists between the two women. And I liked that movie. I walked out of that theater and I enjoyed that movie, and I thought it was like, it was well done. I thought it portrayed a really interesting relationship dynamic between a menage a trois style coupling. I thought it was really, really interesting. And then I got online and I did like 2 seconds of Google research and found out that the granddaughter of William Moulton Marston says, yeah, that's complete bullshit. There was a polyamorous relationship, but Graham and Dots, the two women, were not romantically involved with each other. And that bothers me, because ultimately what you're doing is you are telling people that this is the relationship. When you put the, like, based on a true story in front of something, you're telling people this is how it was. And if that's not true, especially if that's like way, way off the mark like it was here, that's a problem, because now people are going to see this movie and they're going to be like, oh yeah, Marston was in a relationship with two lesbian women. No, he wasn't. And so, like, you might have a point that you're trying to make about polyamorous relationships and stuff, but you end up undercutting that point by not showing the accurate relationship that did exist. So, Steve, take me on this one. I am curious. Since you are Rasco's right in the middle, I'm on one far side, you're on the other far side.
Okay, so when we say how accurate something has to be to the literal events that happen, if you're going to say it's based on a true story, you aren't going to say that, okay, let's say, for example, there was a famous bank robbery, and then someone's like, okay, I'm going to make this into a movie. So, based on the true story of Bank Robbery X.
D.B. Cooper, let's go with that. Let's go with the D.B. Cooper heist.
Sure, okay, so let's say D.B. Cooper heist. And then someone's like, okay, let's make a movie about that. And then they make the movie, and it's about a guy that sells shoes. That's not happening there. Like, that's if you're going to base something on something else, the fact that the literal events in question are the things that are being portrayed are not up for debate. So when I say things don't have to be accurate at all, I'm not saying you can literally make a different thing. I'm saying that the way the events are presented don't have to have accuracy to the way in which they happen. They just have to be presented. And I agree, because people are dumb and they're going to take these movies as their actual history, there is a level of ethical obligation, but then also more than that, there is sort of what are you doing to the actual people? Are you, like, for example, enhancing their suffering by lying about what's happening? Are you potentially glorifying people that ought not be glorified? So, there's ethical considerations in how accurate you make this because of the relationship that piece has to the world. But the idea that something that's based on a true event has to be accurate to it, I think is too limiting and unnecessary, because the idea of taking history, whatever we want to consider history to mean, and turning it into art is inherently a type of translation and a type of interpretation. And after you jump that bridge from one thing to the other, they aren't beholden to each other. Now suddenly they become a different thing. A dramatization of real events are not real events. Mm-hmm. They are in their own universe. And from there are ethical considerations you have to make about what this art does to the world, but the art has no obligation to the thing that created it.
Mm-hmm. I see where you come from with that, and I think that works in some things, but, like, again, I feel like you are, on some level, you know, spitting on a grave with some kinds of interpretations, or you're just making things that, like, don't make any sense.
Well, okay, so let me use an example of something that's, like, a really bad way of being inaccurate. So, like, Pain and Gain, the Michael Bay movie, which is garbage. It's based on actual criminals that, like, actually broke into someone's house and, like, terrorized them and then left. And then the movie is about those two guys that did it, and it makes them look like the coolest dude bros ever. And it's almost a comedy. And so in that way, the accuracy's not there at all. But there is a massive problem with that movie in that you basically just glorified two evil people, and there is a huge ethical issue here. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a problem. But that I don't think that's a problem because the movie is inaccurate. I think that's a problem in that the way the movie's being read is spitting on someone's grave. It's not that, like, simply making this is the bad thing. It's that the way it's being made and the world it's being released to is the bad thing.
Okay, well,
like, accuracy isn't the standard. Okay.
My example, my go-to for when this is a problem is Braveheart. Because, like, the writer of Braveheart has straight up come out and said, Braveheart isn't about trying to be historically accurate, it's about trying to capture a mood and a feeling of a people. And I'm like, okay, fine, but then make a fictionalized movie. Don't make something that's meant to be read as history. And when you do fictionalize it to such a ridiculous degree, you've actually undercut your point, because the like big middle finger to the English identity is that a Scot rebel slept with the future Queen of England, and then she had the lineage that eventually became to rule England. Here's the thing. After William Wallace, the British monarchs were still dicks to Scotland. So your point was that Scots were dicks to each other? What? It's a stupid thing. You fictionalized it to such a degree that you created a stupid contradiction within your thing. So I feel like this attempt to fictionalize and embolden and go crazy with something actually undercut the point of trying to fictionalize something. And if you just fictionalized it to begin with, you wouldn't. If you just admitted you were fictionalizing it to begin with, you wouldn't have this problem, because that wouldn't be the interpretation to go with anymore.
Okay, well, so, and here's an example on the other end of the spectrum of something that is based on true events, is inaccurate to those events, but is entirely in line with historically the impact and meaning of those events. So let's say, for example, what's it called? What is that biopic? A Beautiful Mind. Mm-hmm. A Beautiful Mind is really, really inaccurate. Like the relationship he has to his wife, the way he came up with the equation, like everything about, like, John Nash's life in that movie is almost scene for scene. There are problems in, like, how accurate it is. But John Nash loves that movie. It's a good movie. It's entirely true to the spirit of that history, even though it's inaccurate. And so if the inaccuracy isn't bothering the history, then what's the point of being accurate?
Okay, well, like, here's the question, because I don't know a ton about John Nash, but, like, is there, like, it might get a lot of the details wrong, but it doesn't give John Nash the credit for inventing the cure for polio or creating the bomb, right?
But I mean, that goes back to the other point of like, if you're putting it based on true stories, you are being literal to the degree that it's based on the true story. Like, if they changed history to the extent that he created the bomb, then it is a fiction. Then it's not based on a true story, and then you kind of invalidate the question.
Yeah, and that's my point. Is like, if you're putting based on a true story in front of your movie, should you have to, on some level, be accurate to the actual history? Like, okay, Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman.
Accurate to the extent that it's literally the history. Like, you want to give it the charity of, like, based on a true story to the extent that, like, you're not literally making it a different thing and saying it's this other thing. Like, it's not like you're saying, I'm going to write B and then you end up writing C. It's just a matter of, I'm going to write B. How well did you write the letter B?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing for me is, like, Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, which is the thing that got this all in my head, is, okay, yeah, it's a biopic. They fudge and move things around, and it's not a huge problem to do that. Like, I don't need everything to be literally the thing that happened. I'm okay with details getting wrong, because guess what? Historians get details wrong all the fucking time. It's ridiculous. What I want is for just the literal events to line up in some fashion to the point where I might as well have watched a completely fictionalized version. So like Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, in that he goes to DC Comics for the first time to pitch Wonder Woman. That's the first time he ever walks into the building. Whereas in reality, Marston was already consulting with DC as a child psychologist expert kind of thing, and Gaines said to him, hey, why don't you create a comic book? Kind of jokingly, and he took the idea home to his wife, and she told him, do it, but make her a girl. Or make it a woman. So like that, that kind of distinction, it's not entirely important. The distinction of creating a relationship between the two women in Marston's life, independently of him, and having that be, like, the leg that entire movie stands on, is a just glaring inaccuracy that screams of laziness and becomes a problem that contradicts part of the point of what the movie was trying to do, which is let you know the story behind the creation of Wonder Woman.
Well, and I mean, I think there's a difference between, like, being inaccurate and straight up lying, though, especially when it comes to, like, the idea of fictionalization. Because if you're going to turn history into a film or a story of any kind, then you necessarily have to change things. Like, there's no such thing as a movie based on true events that is ever going to be 100% accurate, nor should it ever try to be 100% accurate, because a movie is not history. It isn't, by definition. So I think that, like, the idea that accuracy matters only matters up to the point of, like, the history is the outline of the events.
Yeah, and that's...
After that, I don't think there's anything beholden to accuracy, because accuracy after that is just how literally you can connect the dots. When you straight up invent and lie about what happened, I think it's a different conversation.
Well, no, see, that's what I'm using the term accuracy for. Does it have to be accurate at all? You said at the very beginning, you said, no, it doesn't have to be accurate in the slightest. And I disagree with that, because I feel like if a movie isn't accurate in the slightest to the history it is based on, then it is lying by definition. It doesn't have to get every single detail right, because again, historians fuck up constantly. It's hilarious. But what a movie that is based on true events needs to do is on some level make a genuine attempt to show you things to show you on some level the events that happened, not to create a brand new story and tell you it was the events. Pocahontas, for example.
Is the intent of adapting, I guess I'm going to use that word, history, to tell you history, or is it to tell a story?
Oh, God.
Because a movie based on a true event is not a documentary.
Here's
a documentary being inaccurate is a bigger problem than a movie being inaccurate.
Here's one of, like, the things that's weird about, like, the spirit that's kind of weird on, like, a like it's kind of counterintuitive to the spirit of telling a true story. Oftentimes when we tell true stories, it like in movie format or whatever, it's because like this story is so cool, it's so inspiring, or it does something and it just moves people in a way. It needs to be told, okay? There's something about what's cool about it is that it really happened. So something about taking something and then like radically changing it to make it more of a movie, to make it either cooler or more exciting, goes against like the very spirit of even bothering to tell something that literally happened.
Yeah. And it's funny to, like, the granddaughter of Marston, I can't remember, Christy Marston, she has a Twitter, and it's funny to see her reacting to this movie about her grandfather, because she goes, no, the real story's more interesting. Why would you do this? And yeah, I don't want to pick on that movie too much, but it's what put this idea in my head, so it's kind of my go-to right now. That and Braveheart. Like, you know, I mean, I can imagine in a world where I didn't know what I know about Braveheart that I would have enjoyed Braveheart a lot more. And, like, I know from walking out of Marston and Wonder Woman, like, I enjoyed the fuck out of that movie. I mean, hell, lesbian sex. Every movie can benefit from more lesbian sex. Let's just be honest with ourselves. But, like, you know, I walked out of it, and there's the difference between feeling good from, like, a satisfying and interesting story and feeling good from something that is portraying, on some level, real events. And I feel like it's really different, because when you are portraying real events, if you're not going to at least strive for some level of capturing the events, why even bother doing it? Why not just make a story?
But you are making a story. You are, from the beginning, just making a story. It just so happens that real events are your basis. Like, so I think there's two steps here. There is the person who writes a story that's based on historical events, and then there is the work of art that has a connection to actual history. And art's relationship to the world around it is an ethical space where you can talk about whether or not the thing lying to you is an ethical problem or not. But insofar as a person's writing a story, I don't think they have any obligation whatsoever to be accurate. It's just a matter of, like, after you make something and it is inaccurate, you face the consequences of what those inaccuracies do in the world that story is now in. So, like, the what's it called, Argo. Argo's a really good example of this, where, like, Argo is wrong about a lot, and it's wrong in a particular way in which it helps aggrandize American propaganda and increases fears of Middle Eastern countries, as well as kind of, like, clustering all of those people as if they're the same person. And, like, there's a more accurate critique of, like, what Argo is doing wrong in relationship to the world we live in right now and why it shouldn't do these things wrong. Writing Argo based on a true event as a story before it's a recording of history, at that stage, there is no obligation for that story to be accurate. It's what that story does afterwards that matters, and that's independent of the person writing the story having some obligation to be accurate.
Okay, and, like, here, let me explain why I think that this is a dangerous precedent that has already been set. It's not that it sets a dangerous precedent. This is a dangerous precedent that has been set, and this is why I would like to move away from these things. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. For what reason? Ask a second grader. It was to prove that the earth was round. It was not to prove that the earth was round. We already knew the earth was round. We knew the earth was round since the times of Aristotle. The reason Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean is because he was attempting to circumnavigate a route to India. And then when he got to the New World, he enslaved and, you know, genocided all over the place, right? But because we choose to remember this fictionalized account where Columbus was this man of vision who stood up to the all-knowers of the world and said, no, I'm going to prove to you that the Earth is round by circumnavigating, well, that's a good story. But it has had the inadvertent effect of glorifying a murderer.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you there, but like, I think there's like this notion of like accuracy that forgets that accuracy is only brought into question when two things literally have to be different. So the story of Columbus, or the historical truth of Columbus, however you want to define history and truth, and a story about Columbus are, no matter what, two different things. And so these two different things don't have any obligation to each other. It's only afterwards that this starts to matter. So, like, accuracy to what really happened is always going to be relative to the consequences that come after it. So, like, if you want to almost Watchmen style lie to the world in order to create a kind of world peace, I almost feel like that's all right on some level, because at that point the accuracy is doing nothing but hurting. If you want to, like for Argo, for example, if you want to uphold Argo as a good movie, you still at the same time have to reconcile the critique of like how that movie being made is propagating certain lies, certain phobias, and certain cultural problems as is. It's not doing that because it's inaccurate, but its inaccuracies are a product of it. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And so, like, you know, you have this view of like, well, when you do it in a way that's okay, that makes it okay. But I think that's a dangerous precedent to accept, because to some people, their perspective of, well, ignore the murders that Columbus committed, celebrate the discovery because then it gave us, you know, this country, that was worth it. So we're going to purposefully ignore those things. So it's I'm not saying like there's a justification like that, especially for Columbus, because fuck Columbus. No, but I'm saying like people can have the ethical philosophy that differs from you, and they can use the same logic to say, well, Columbus created a better world. So but they literally can't say Columbus created a better world, or they're just lying. I mean, he created a better world for some people, right? Like, yeah, but he didn't create a better world. Like, you at that point, you're trying to say truth is, or morality is relative in a case where it's just not. Where, like, if anyone's trying to argue Columbus created a better world, they're just lying. No, I agree. I'm just saying, they either don't know or they're lying. No, I agree. I'm just saying, like, they can have a skewed ethical perspective and use the same logic, is my point. But then if they're having a skewed ethical perspective, then the ethics of accuracy stop mattering, because the person won't get it anyway. Maybe, but I feel like it's a really, really fine line and a really dangerous precedent. That does exist. I mean, it's not a matter of creating a dangerous precedent. It is a matter of perpetuating a dangerous precedent. And I mean, I agree with you to an extent, because I think ultimately art is the best, if not the strongest way in which like our culture grows, and like morality in particular gets propagated in important ways. So art being good is important to society prospering in ethical ways. So if inaccurate history in a movie is going to create things that are bad for society, that's going to be a problem. At the same time, though, I don't think a movie based on historical events causing problems or perpetuating problems in society are a problem because they're inaccurate. I think there's a problem already happening that inaccuracy is already just a product of. You aren't inaccurate to events because you want to like create something wrong. Something's already wrong, and therefore you created inaccurate events. I don't know. It feels like you're really playing with too fine a line, and I want a much more definite answer on this one, as far as where I'm standing. And that's fair. This because I just believe that, like, the fact that we ignore change and forget history is like 90% of the problem as to why horrible things keep happening. Like,
and I mean, I agree with that. But like you said, history changes all the time. It's going to be a matter of how history being interpreted is conditioning us to move forward. So you're never going to get like an accurate picture of history. You're always going to get a culture that understands their history in a particular way. And the better you can allow a culture to interpret history in morally acceptable ways, the better you're going to get. That doesn't mean that a culture gets to know history on an objective truth level. It just means the culture knows what to take away from history that they can take away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with that part. And I don't know, like, I just come back to, when you do this, you get really, really dangerously close to, and you fall into the trap of, you know, celebrating people who don't deserve it and ignoring people whose stories should be told.
I agree.
Sticking with American Revolution, or sticking with America, we'll talk about American Revolution. Listen, my children, you shall hear about the midnight ride of who?
Paul Revere.
Except you shouldn't, because Paul Revere rode like fucking 4 miles. Paul Revere didn't do jack shit. You know who rode like the big ride that we actually talk about? Guy's name was Israel Bissell. You know why Israel Bissell doesn't get the fucking credit for it in the goddamn poem? It's because his name is Israel Bissell, and Israel Bissell's a bitch to rhyme. And so, like,
True.
you're like, you know, regardless of feelings on like American Revolution and all that shit, like, just the fact is the man did an accomplishment, and it was taken away from him because someone else had a better name to rhyme with and had a more pleasing background, being that Paul Revere and the family's history with silversmithing and stuff.
Well, and what's it called? Hidden Figures is a really good example of this too, where like the idea that a group of women, let alone black women, are the reason we got to space is a thing we conveniently choose to forget.
Yeah. And so like Hidden Figures is a good example of actually acknowledging these things. And I haven't had a chance to see that movie, and I don't know how accurate it is, but like that is something that I feel we need to see more of. And with the case of Professor Marston and Wonder Woman, there are couples out there who lived in the way in which the author of that movie portrays them. It's just those couples didn't invent Wonder Woman. So we're just going to fudge this relationship because it'll sell better. And that's something that irks the shit out of me, and I really, really resist. I feel that it cuts in a dangerous way when you do stuff like this, and it always bothers me. So, I'll never be the person that's like, every single detail needs to be perfectly accurate down to every last little thing. No, of course not. Again, historians fuck up all the time. What I need is, it has to meet with a general sense of the outline. You can condense events, I don't mind. You can over-dramatize something for the sake of the movie, but you cannot just blatantly lie. And that's the problem that I feel like a lot of these things that market themselves as based on a true story fall into, is they blatantly lie, they change stuff to such a degree that it's not true anymore, like the Paul Revere thing. And that is a problem. No matter what you say, that is a problem for me.
And I agree with you. I just think there's a reversal happening where you're like, accuracy determines the ethics, and I think the ethics determine the accuracy. So, like, I think you need to focus on telling an ethical story in art. Whether or not it's accurate is going to be contingent on whether or not it's ethical first. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're going to tell something that's inaccurate, and we can determine the ethical problems that have happened because of this, it's not so much a problem of being inaccurate. The problem is that it's unethical. So you don't want to propagate lies about Paul Revere because you don't want to propagate lies, not because the poem being inaccurate is a problem. It's that this is a problem, therefore the accuracy is the problem.
Yeah, and that's what I come down on, is like, I don't care if you want to tell like a saucy threesome story with some lesbianism in it and attach it to Wonder Woman. Marsden would love that shit himself. I care that you're doing that in a way and presenting it to people as if this is the relationship that actually existed. When, and the funny thing is the writer is like, oh, well, I purposefully didn't contact the family because I wanted it to be my interpretation. Well, that's not your interpretation. That's laziness. That's wanting it to be this way. And I have a problem with that. Wishing for something is not good enough when you're showing actual people's lives. There are ethical considerations separate from, just the general sense of should you do it. There's the ethical consideration of like, how comfortable would this person be being portrayed in that way? And even if they'd be cool with it, still there's an underlying issue on kind of more of a fundamental level for me.
Yeah.
Rasco, you have not talked in like a minute, so fucking say some shit.
I'm so confused about how I feel. I mean, I don't really have a strong position on this to argue from. Like, I'm confused, but I understand that there's... So one thing I think is that there's a weird area of overlap where, like, inspired by and based on, I kind of agree, like, they don't mean the same thing. But would you say that there's, like, an overlap between the two of them where it's like there are things that are just on the edge of inspired by and based on, and they kind of, there's like just, they're in both of those categories?
Oh, definitely. Dances with Wolves.
Okay.
Like, Dances with Wolves truncates the timeline, it creates fictional characters set in that area. It does a lot of, like, different things, but the very important difference is, like, it does a lot of different things that would otherwise make it inspired by, but the very important difference is just about everything you see happen in that movie are things that actually happened in that region of the country. Like, there's this scene where the Native Americans and Kevin Costner come over a hill, and there's just a bunch of dead skinned buffalo just lying in the fields with their tongues cut out. And you can look up old pictures of fields like that, but that was like, 10 to 20 years after the events of this movie, or after the events of in which this movie is set. So, like, that's inspired by true events, but it's also very clearly based on true events in a way that, feeling inspired. What's the movie? The Strangers? You ever heard of that one? It's a horror movie.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The writer of that, it's like, that the movie's marketed as inspired by true events. The writer's inspiration was, when he was a kid, some weird people were, like, knocking on his front door and asking if someone that, like, no one had ever heard of was there. And then when they told him no, they walked away. And then later, like, the next day, they heard that there was a break-in. And so it was clearly someone casing the neighborhood trying to figure out who was home and who wasn't. And so, but in the movie, the person knocks on the door, asks if this person is there, they tell him no, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of people try to break into the house and murder everybody. So, like, there's a very clear distinction between inspiring and basing there. And so, I don't know, it's a big spaghetti mess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what about movies like Pearl Harbor, for example?
Oh, fucking God.
Because
Yeah.
I haven't seen that movie actually,
Oh,
but I always
interesting.
hear that people say it's kind of just like they took, obviously something that really happened and just kind of made like an action disaster movie out of it. And one of the things that's like interesting about that is that like that and a movie like Saving Private Ryan are kind of like on polar opposites of quality, but they're kind of doing the same thing almost. Where it's like, would you say that Saving Private Ryan is based on true events?
Yeah, because, like, Spielberg was like recreating actual footage of D-Day for that opening scene.
Yeah, it's based on the true events, and that like all of the events you're seeing, like they all happened. Like you're not seeing big events that didn't happen in history, but it's like, does any of the personal stories at all happen? Period.
And if I remember in particular,
that's the weird thing with the inspired by, because like it's a movie inspired by D-Day. It's not a movie based on Private Ryan.
I'm trying to remember. I think there was like really, really loosely a mission that was like the basic mission of Saving Private Ryan. They heavily fictionalized it, but I think the reason that movie gets a pass is they fictionalized it to the point where they're creating new characters, and they took pains to make everything else around it as reasonably accurate as possible. There's this great moment in Saving Private Ryan that like no one talks about. So they're on the beach. They finally push through some of the fortifications, and the American soldiers come up and they see two guys in German uniforms who are like waving at them and smiling and speaking an Eastern European language. And the Americans smile back, and they're like nodding their head, and they talk to each other, and they go, "Oh, look, we got a couple Krauts surrendering to us." And the guy goes, "Yeah, what do you think of that?" And like the guys are just waving, and they're happy. And then the American soldiers shoot these two supposedly German soldiers. Here's the detail that Spielberg put in about that. Those guys are actually speaking, if I'm remembering correctly, Czech. Because the German army conscripted, after it conquered Czechoslovakia, it conscripted Czech soldiers for their army and put them in the fortifications at D-Day. These guys were basically like, if you don't fight, you will be shot. So they were surrendering to potentially fight with the Americans. But since the Americans just didn't notice the distinction between one Eastern European language and the other, they shot him. And I mean, like, that's a war crime. Shooting someone surrendering. 2, that's, like, really fucked up. And 3, that's an event that actually happened. So there's, like, all these layers to different things in that movie of, like, these are actually things that happened in World War II. And, yeah, they're adding fictional characters to it, but just on a lot of different levels, the situations aren't unbelievable. This again walks that line between inspired and based, but I would say Saving Private Ryan leaves much more heavily on based than Pearl Harbor, because Pearl Harbor fictionalizes things to a ridiculous degree, wherein two pilots are able to get off the ground on Pearl Harbor Day and take out like huge sections of the Japanese Air Force, and that didn't fucking happen.
Yeah,
and they're wearing Hawaiian shirts while they do it, of course. Like there's just a lot of stupid that like it's you look at the difference, and Spielberg, that's a flattering comparison that he definitely doesn't deserve. Whatever.
Oh God, no.
Spielberg actually took the time to do the research on these things, and guess what? He never called attention to it. At no point did Spielberg in any commentary or anything tell you about the Czech thing. You know who told people about the Czech thing that other people like me were able to pick up on and now know that? Audiences in Czechoslovakia. Because they noticed, oh shit, that's our language. These guys are surrendering, saying that they're conscripted by the German army, and the Americans shot them. Great.
Was that supposed to be an insult? Like, I imagine you're just in the theater like, oh, so that's how you feel.
Yeah, so there's that like difference in level of accuracy where just having those very strong, very particular details right will allow you to get away with things that are in the general sense fictionalized, but there's nothing about Saving Private Ryan, aside from maybe the fact that they succeed, that makes the story, the fictional side of that story, completely unbelievable. I mean, like the battle at the end where they're fighting a tank. I mean, yeah, it's a little sensationalized, but that was a thing that actually happened during World War II and in wars since, of ground soldiers having to deal with a tank.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is a thing. So I don't know, like it's a finer line, but yeah, I feel like compared to, you know, Pearl Harbor, where they cut broomsticks and paint them black to fool the enemy into thinking they're turret guns. You're in a fucking bomber thousands of feet up. Why would you bother?
Yeah, it's funny because it's like one of them is changing something. Well, so like one of them is changing the story, is adding things to make this real event seem cooler than it is. And the other isn't trying to make the event seem cooler than it is. It's trying to give you a way to like empathize with maybe some individuals that could have really been in the event. It's about like immersing you in a possible experience that could have happened. It's changing things for a different purpose. And it's a less cynical purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that brings up the question, particularly in respect to Saving Private Ryan. What's the difference between accurate and realistic? Because I feel like Saving Private Ryan is a much more realistic historical film. I don't know how much I want to call it an accurate film, because I don't know what it's accurate to. I think it's a realistic depiction of World War II. But, like, I think that's a different thing.
Yeah, because I guess it relies on the believability. Like, if it's believable, then I would say that it is more realistic.
Yeah, and I mean, because both Pearl Harbor and Saving Private Ryan, both of them are on the opposite end of the spectrum, like you said, and neither one of them are presenting things that are literally the case. They're just in a context and trying to make you as close as possible believe that within this context these things are happening. It just so happens one's better at it than the other. I don't think it's an accuracy thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And maybe this was like my fault for, because I feel like we've debated a lot of what the word accurate means, because I'm kind of just using that term interchangeably with realistic or to the evil events. And maybe I needed to think the term through more and come up with like a better way to phrase it. But to me, realistic, true, accurate, I'm kind of using all synonymously within this context.
I guess I just don't understand how those things could all be the same, because in my head I just feel like when you call something accurate, when you call something realistic, when you call something literal or even like historically accurate, I feel like these are all different ways in which we categorize things that are based on actual events.
When I
say based on actual events, I could mean that in the broadest sense of the movie about World War II is based on actual events because there was a World War II. Mm-hmm. But it could also be as specific as based on this specific thing that happened in that one town.
No, I get you. And that's why I'm saying, like, I should have found a way to formulate that better. I just did not, I go in my head, come back out, and it makes perfect sense. But, you're not doing that, so.
And I memean, I don't think like there is a formation of those words that isn't going to lead to some kind of debate of what those words mean.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate. Like, this is why we have the principle of charity in philosophy, right? Because when you talk about these things, you're supposed to give like the best possible interpretation, which is really hard to do when you're trying to argue against an idea. But yeah, it's one of those things like how accurate is Saving Private Ryan versus how realistic it is. I mean, again, Spielberg had access to things that just, no one else did, because the U.S. military sent photographers to D-Day, to the beach in Normandy, and those guys captured footage that when it came back to Washington, they were like, we cannot let the public know that this is what war is like. We cannot let people see this. So that footage has been archived, and like you have to ask for permission to view it, which Spielberg did. So like he had access to things that no one else has ever seen unless you were on the beach at Normandy, and as such he portrayed things in a way that audiences at the time just were not ready for.
Well, see, this is the other thing about Saving Private Ryan in particular, because Saving Private Ryan is universally acclaimed for the fact that it's really, really, to use your word, accurate to what was happening. I don't know anyone or have ever seen any praise or discussion of whether or not that's a good story, though. Because I don't think it really is. Like, once you get away from the fact that, wow, this is a lot like World War II, it's a really kind of boring, characterless movie.
Really?
Like, what is it about Saving Private Ryan that, as a film, is a good film outside of the fact that this is a thing that literally happened?
Oh, I like it. I mean, I think I think that movie works because it's kind of like a bunch of little short stories.
See, I just don't think they're good stories. I don't know. I don't like Saving Private Ryan very much. I think Tom Hanks is really good in it, and I think there's good in it. But I think the thing that movie has going for it is just that it feels real, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. And that's fair, and that was clearly Spielberg's intent more than anything else. The story there is to provide a way to show all these different sections of the French front, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a lot like Titanic, where the movie is an excuse to do something before it's to tell a story.
Yeah, and so I think that I sympathize. You get invested to some basic degree in the story of Saving Private Ryan, but how long that lasts is up for debate, and I don't think it was the main intent was to tell a really, really compelling story there.
And this is kind of my problem when we talk about being beholden to accuracy, because when you make a movie, you're making a movie. People that like Saving Private Ryan or like Titanic or any documentary style biopics. So there are all these things that are here are the actual events where we're trying to present the actual events. Look at the actual events. Look at it's about, if you're going to make a movie, you're making a story. So tell a story. And then anything that happens after that is a thing that happens after that. The accuracy is after the fact. The morality is after the fact. The focus on accuracy from the inception with these kinds of movies, I think, is a problem, because if we're talking about Saving Private Ryan in a conversation about does accuracy in movies based on real events matter, I think that's a little bit unfair, because that movie's entirely designed to be accurate, as opposed to something like, say, Pain and Gain, or A Beautiful Mind, or The Imitation Game. These are stories, and they're stories based on things that actually happened, because the things that actually happened make for good stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like it's impossible to put accuracy on the top pedestal when it even comes to writing a story, because how do you get anywhere? How do you even put one word on the page? Because from word one, you're already making assumptions. Even if you're trying your best to be as accurate as possible, the moment you write a sentence of this happened, you're already making an assumption.
Yeah,
certainly.
I don't, because this is my thing with accuracy. It's this is why I don't think it matters. I don't think accuracy is the point. I think the point is tell a story in as ethical and as well constructed a way as possible. And then accuracy is a plus or minus after the fact.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I really do, to a big extent, agree with that particular interpretation of events. My problem is I don't feel like... I feel like people often are not assuming things to the best and fairest extent possible. I feel like people are deciding things that they know to be untrue will make for a better story. And I think that in and of itself is unethical. I feel like to knowingly deceive for the sake of the story, and I'm going to go back to Marston and Wonder Woman, it plays better for a general audience to see these two women both love William and they both love one another. That is a beautiful relationship. That plays better for a general audience than what actually happened, which is William Moulton Marston came to his wife with Olive Byrne and said, "Hey, I love her. and I want you to let her in our relationship. And I understand if you don't want to do that, but if that's the case, then I want a divorce. And that is a really, really questionable thing to put someone in. I, as someone who is married, I could not imagine the kind of pressure that would put me under if my partner came to me with that, or vice versa. That is a tremendous ethical thing to wrestle with. And so to knowingly exclude that in favor of portraying a relationship that is more palatable to a general audience is a problem and undercuts the point of what you're doing. Which
and
is
I
to
agree
show
with
the
that.
background of your audience. Or of
And
this
I
character
agree
you
with that.
love.
And I think that's a case of where you're using accuracy to talk about the unethicalness of what's being presented. But this is, again, why I think the ethics of the art come before it being beholden to accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when we talk about like based on true event, there's just so many ways that this thing can get cut up, because I think there's also a distinction between like a biopic and a movie based on a series of events that are happening. So like, say for example, The Town. The Town's based on events. The Town is based on a physical thing that happened, versus The Imitation Game, which is based on the life of a person. Mm-hmm. And so being accurate to what a person did versus being accurate to physical circumstances that happened, those are two very different standards. And then accuracy for those two things mean two very, very different things. Where like the people involved in the events matter less if you're talking about something like The Town, but the accuracy to who this person was matters more if you're talking about a specific person.
Agreed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really agree with that. It is a fine line, and again, I do not think that it has to be absolute. I am perfectly fine with fudging things for the sake of story, but there is a point at which you have to be, at least on some level, conscious of how that is affecting the actual person or persons.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Because, like, when you just decide to throw out accuracy on things, you get some really weird things. Like, I'm trying to remember, it's not called It's a Wonderful Life. There's a movie, and I cannot recall the name of it off the top of my head. Life is Great, maybe. That's set in a Jewish... is it a Jewish camp? No, it's a concentration camp. It is set in a concentration camp. And it tries to be a comedy. And, like, in order to do that, it doesn't show the actual accurate realities of what happened to people in those camps. It shows that they were living there and that they had to carve out a way to exist there. And that is a really unethical thing to try to portray.
Oh, absolutely.
To clean the Holocaust up to make something palatable and funny is not okay.
Would you still have a problem with it if it didn't clean up any of the details and somehow, while being completely accurate, still managed to be a comedy?
I think it's not a comedy, but I think Schindler's List has comedic moments that are, that are still showing the very harsh reality of the Holocaust. Like, and not, it's showing the harsh reality of the Holocaust in one scene and it's being comedic in another. There is a scene in particular that, like, people always call me crazy for telling them it's hilarious. I cannot, it's been years since I've seen Schindler's List. The main Jewish character that Oskar Schindler works with throughout the entire movie, it's weird that we're on a Spielberg kick tonight. He, at one point, gets pulled out of the factory that they're working in by a group of Nazis and, like, the main Nazi antagonist of the movie, the main SS officer. And they throw him on the ground, and the officer pulls out his pistol, points it at the guy's head, and pulls the trigger. But it's also winter right now, so the gun jams. And he goes, scheist. And he, like, pulls the gun away and like, bangs it with his hand a couple times and points it at the guy's head again and pulls the trigger. and it jams again. And he looks over at the other two Nazi soldiers with him, and he like gestures for them to give one of them his firearm, and one does, and he points the gun at the guy's head for the third time, and it jams again. And the way that scene is shot is a comedy. It is a dark comedy, and like after the third time they just give up and walk away, which kind of shows just how dispassionate they are about killing these people. They just walk away, and the guy like sits there and cries on the ground because he just survived death 3 times based on nothing but pure luck and cold weather. But I will defend with every fiber of my being, the way that scene is shot is a comedy. Like everything about that scene is in a just literal sense of this is going to sound so bad, so I'm picking my words very carefully. Everything about the way that scene is shot and portrayed is ludicrous. And that's the point of it, because it wants to show that, you know, these crazy things that happen to you in day-to-day life that you just cannot believe that, you know, are the kinds of things that happen to sitcom characters could even happen in the worst possible circumstances, like a concentration camp. And so there's a very big difference, again, between that and between something that tries to show a comedy in a concentration camp. And to be fair, I don't know the accuracy of that story. I've, you know, listened to a lot of interviews with Holocaust survivors, and as far as I can remember, nothing comes to mind for me that is anywhere close to that story. I know Spielberg has also listened to a lot of interviews. Maybe he did. Just for the sake of whether or not that an event like that actually occurred. Now I gotta wonder, since it's quiet, if I said some really fucked up shit now and everyone's just very offended.
I don't know. I'm just considering it. Because I think that, like, there's... It's sort of like that thing of, like, when is it okay to joke about something? Mm-hmm. And I never liked that question, because I think with the way jokes work and the way you can read a room and you know when something's funny, and whether or not it's funny tells you whether or not this is a good room to be in. If you're in a room with a bunch of skinheads and you have an anti-Semitic joke, yeah, the joke's going to play and it's going to be funny, but no, you shouldn't say the joke because fuck you, that's awful. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, there are things like, is the Holocaust ever funny? No, it's not. It doesn't matter what audience you're in. And so, like, in a case like that, I think there's like I think you can be respectful without being accurate. Like, mm-hmm. If you made a movie that showed the Holocaust as worse than it was, is that a problem?
Only in the sense that if you make it worse than it actually... It's interesting because we talked about Allegiance, which is a play about the Japanese internment camps, for our replacement for fan film reviews for the month. And that is a movie that, like, displays the conditions of the Japanese internment camps as worse than they, as far as I'm aware, were ever reported to be. Worse than they were ever reported to be. And so that play, that musical, has a very clear intent, which is to show people in the now the dangers of the type of thinking that we're dealing with today and what that could lead to. But if that's the kind of audience you're going for and you exaggerate the conditions of the history you're portraying, you risk losing that audience and them writing it off as exaggeration and what's the word here? I don't know. Quick-headedness, I guess. I don't know. You risk losing the people who need to see your message the most because they're looking for any excuse to write it off.
Yeah, like there's lies that can be convenient now, but really inconvenient later.
Yeah.
And when you're not trying to get people to understand something when you're not putting truth first, it's not that necessarily people having a somewhat skewed perception of a historical event one way or the other is going to be a huge problem now. But in 30 years, when we're using things that happen now to like understand, like, well, how did we react to this specific event? Like, what were the kinds of dividing lines that were being drawn, and what side of the aisle were people falling on this particular issue? If eventually all of these like small times throughout history where we've tried to slightly persuade people to believe that something was a little bit more like this or a little bit more like this, that's when those things really add up, and skewed perceptions matter when you're really far removed from something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like this is, it's annoying because idiots use this point to justify being Nazis, which is always annoying, but there is something to the point of don't abuse the term Nazi, otherwise people won't believe you when you call someone a Nazi. And like that doesn't mean that you can't call Trump a Nazi. That means that maybe everyone who's, a Republican isn't a Nazi. And that's a statement I agree with. I mean, I don't think that it's, unfortunately that's getting to be less of a statement I can agree with, but, there's like the stereotypical idea of like the fiscal conservative speaking somewhere and someone calls him a Nazi, and it's like, okay, come the fuck on. There's a line, and that is crossing it. You by all means please disagree with these people. Please. But civility matters. And when you break that, you actually weaken the term in the minds of others. Like, can you imagine if we lived in the world, and this is the point of History Month, to get political as fuck. Can you imagine if we lived in the world where no modern politician was ever called a Nazi until Trump? What would that have done to his campaign?
I mean, that's a good point. It's
words have power, right? And every time you use something like that, you run the risk of diminishing it. And I feel like the shock, the impact of that phrase was taken away because it was overused.
Well, and I mean, the part of the pushback I'll give you on that is that the reason it never fell out of use is because Nazis never went away. People
Agreed.
just got more and more cool with them because they didn't have the power to do as bad as worse things as they used to.
Yes, 100% agree. I'm just trying I'm trying my best to portray the more level perspective, I guess. The more distance perspective for people that either don't or haven't thought to acknowledge that. But I agree with you 100% there.
And I mean, because ultimately my thing with why you should even bother with considering ethics and stuff like that in movies is that like I think there's a certain level of truth a work of art can give you that reading a history book just can't. Like I think there's a genuine difference, and sometimes something for the better when you watch a movie based on an event as opposed to just reading what happened in a textbook somewhere.
Oh yeah, definitely, because you can be emotionally persuaded. It's just what you don't want is you don't want to be emotionally persuaded by a work of art and then have someone come along and be able to completely destroy that work of art for you, because that very much bears the possibility of undermining your newfound persuasion.
Well, and this is where I think the ethics trump the accuracy, because I think the textbook that people want to say is completely objective and completely dispassionate is not that. Both a historical text and a work of art are attempting to manipulate you in certain ways. It's just a matter of which one is trying to manipulate you for the good of it. Like, there are history books that are just bad, that are
agreed.
wrong.
Agreed.
So, like, it's that kind of thing where, like, I think the accuracy matters because we care about people. and we care about how we're evolving as a society, not because the literal things that need to be represented have meaning in their literalness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately my thing with movies that are based in any historical event or any historical person. I don't care so much of what they did. I care how what they did can be interpreted and how you're using those to give us something useful.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to end it, unless anyone had anything else they wanted to bring up.
Pizza.
Pizza?
I love pizza.
Here's my question for you, alright? It's not about pizza specifically, but pizza is tangentially involved. Alright. So, Marco Polo travels across... Wait, no, is it Marco Polo? Yeah, it travels across the east to China, brings back noodles to Europe, right? Okay. Then Columbus goes west, discovers America. Eventually, we bring tomatoes back to Europe. What the fuck is Italian food?
Well, shit.
Right?
Why don't you just ruin the whole world, man?
I learned from watching you, Steve.
You're not wrong.
Okay. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode of Geeky Gentleman History Month. Rasco, we need a historical piece to review for next week.
Gosh!
It can be period piece. Doesn't have to be accurate to history. It can be just set in a period. That's fine too.
Oh gosh. Oh my gosh. So, we're not just going based on a true story?
No, you can totally pick period pieces. I mean, fuck it. I picked Zorro for one of the things.
Okay.
I mean, just like no fantasy. Like Game of Thrones doesn't count.
Yeah. Okay, I have like a movie that's like based on a true story that comes to my head, but it's not like that long ago that it's based on a true story. Will that work?
Yeah.
Like, is that against?
That's fine.
Have you guys ever reviewed the movie 127 Hours?
Nope, that's fine though. We can do that.
Awesome. Let's talk about that.
Okay, cool. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
I'm the Exile.
And I'm the beta male cuck.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.